In 1987, in Goiânia, Brazil, two men named Dever and Lucio are collecting scrap metal to sell. They enter an abandoned radiotherapy clinic and make their way to the furthest room where they find a lead capsule. Dever tells Lucio it is worth a lot of money, but Lucio is skeptical because nobody would just abandon something expensive. They load it onto a wheelbarrow and drag it to Dever's house, where they use tools to break it open, only to find a second capsule inside. 5 days later, the two men bring the capsule to a local scrapyard, and the owner, Evandro, buys it. That night, scrapyard employees manage to open the capsule and cut the cables on its lid. When Evandro turns off the lights to close his shop, he notices that the capsule is glowing and decides to take it home. 10 days later, Evandro's wife Gabriela keeps vomiting and coughing. Evandro thinks it is because of something they ate, but Gabriela says she has been sick for several days. When Evandro mentions the glowing capsule, Gabriela says she has no idea what it is and scolds him for bringing it into the house, calling it evil because she believes it is making them all sick. After Evandro leaves, Gabriela reveals she has hidden the capsule under the sink. She asks a scrapyard employee named Edmilson to carry it, and together they board a bus. They eventually reach the health department and wait for hours, refusing to leave without speaking to someone. The director agrees to hear them out. Gabriela explains that the capsule has made everyone sick, including all the scrapyard employees, Lucio and Dever. The director thinks it must be food poisoning, but Gabriela points out that it happened to families living in completely different houses. Suddenly, Gabriela feels dizzy and goes outside for fresh air, only to vomit. The director tells her to go to a clinic, so Gabriela says she will only go if he agrees to get rid of the capsule. Once he accepts the deal, Edmilson drops the bag and takes Gabriela to the clinic. The next morning becomes the first day of the radioactive emergency, which unfortunately coincides with a strike at the General Hospital. At the clinic, Dr. Ricardo examines all the new patients, including Gabriela, Lucio, Dever, and the scrapyard workers. They all suffer from dizziness, vomiting, hair loss, and blisters. Meanwhile, nuclear physicist Marcio receives exciting news from his girlfriend Bianca, who tells him she is pregnant. They are both very happy. They then have breakfast with Marcio's father, since they came from the city to celebrate his birthday. Bianca wants to tell his father about the pregnancy, but Marcio refuses. At that moment, Marcio gets a call from Dr. Ricardo, who describes the patient's symptoms and believes it could be radioactive poisoning. Marcio doubts it because it would require extremely heavy exposure. Ricardo then mentions the capsule, and Marcio agrees to come and check it out. The director picks Marcio up, and Marcio brings a Geiger counter, which is a device that detects radiation. As soon as they get close to the health department, the device goes completely wild, and Marcio assumes it must be broken. They go back to a lab to get another one. Meanwhile, the director's secretary, frightened by the capsule, calls the fire department to come and take it away. When the two men return, they find the road blocked by a fire truck. The Geiger counter immediately goes off, so the director and Marcio run to the firefighter and make him drop the bag. Marcio scolds the director for being irresponsible and convinces him to organize an evacuation, comparing the situation to Chernobyl. The director activates the fire alarm to clear the building, and the capsule is placed back inside. Marcio is now worried that other locations may also be contaminated, so they check the records to get the scrapyard's address. When they arrive there, the counter goes off again. They try to speak to Evandro, but he thinks they are police and tries to throw them out. When they explain that everyone is in danger, one of the employees, who also has blisters, tells them where Dever and Lucio originally found the capsule. The director and Marcio go to the abandoned clinic, but the device detects no radiation there. Marcio immediately recognizes the equipment that originally held the capsule and cannot believe that such dangerous material was simply left behind. Next, they visit the Secretary of Health, Emerson. He is furious because the press has already been investigating the incident at the health department, and he refuses to order an evacuation of the town, claiming he does not have the authority to do it. He also will not call the governor. When Marcio continues to explain the danger, they contact the National Nuclear Energy Commission. A specialist named Benny checks his files and confirms that the clinic shut down 3 years ago. A cobalt machine was removed, but a second unit that was never collected remains inside. That unit contains cesium-137, a highly radioactive substance. Marcio finally gets through to Governor Roberto and explains that cesium-137 is a fine powder that spreads from person to person. Roberto immediately agrees to evacuate all the exposed people to the local stadium. Tents and security measures are set up at the stadium that night. Later, relatives and scrapyard employees confront Evandro because more people are getting sick. He thinks it is just an allergic reaction that will clear up now that the capsule is gone. At that moment, Emerson and Marcio arrive with police. They explain what has happened, and Marcio uses the counter to prove the house is also contaminated. Evandro still refuses to cooperate. Then suddenly the counter goes wild because it is detecting extremely high radiation coming from Evandro's niece, Celeste, who is beginning to show symptoms. This finally convinces the family to go to the stadium. Back at Marcio's family home, his father is disappointed that his son never showed up for his birthday party. The mood falls further when they hear about a radioactive incident in their town. Evandro's evacuation was filmed on the news, and the family is shocked to see Marcio in the footage. Benny soon arrives at the stadium and tells Marcio he acted quickly and well. Benny now wants to test all the isolated patients to determine who is infected, and is shocked to learn that some people are already at the regular clinic since those patients need to be isolated too. Benny then goes to the health department and uses a more advanced device, which confirms maximum radiation levels. Approaching the capsule is extremely dangerous, so a concrete containment structure needs to be built around it. Benny scans Marcio and confirms he is not contaminated, but his shoes are, so he takes them off and throws them inside the health department. When Marcio arrives home, he leaves his clothes outside to avoid putting his family at risk. Bianca and his father immediately bombard him with questions, and in the commotion, Bianca accidentally reveals her pregnancy. Marcio's father wants to hug him in happiness, but Marcio steps back and asks them to keep their distance until he has showered. At the health department, a container is brought in to cover the capsule with cement. Benny receives a call from Caesar, the head of his institution, who sends a team and expresses concern that the water supply may also be contaminated. The next morning, Bianca argues with Marcio and tells him she does not want him continuing on the case. Marcio explains that he has a responsibility, and that if they do not end this quickly, his own family could be in danger too. On television, Benny assures a reporter that the capsule has been contained, but that the radioactive powder may have spread across parts of the city. He asks anyone who had contact with the powder, or who spent time with someone who did, to go to the stadium immediately. When Marcio arrives at the stadium, he finds a desperate crowd waiting to be examined. Emerson tells Marcio and Benny that the infected patients will be transferred to hospital within the hour. Benny asks whether the hospital is truly prepared because the isolation must be absolute. For example, the patient's waste cannot go into regular sewers because it will cause more contamination. When Governor Roberto arrives, the crowd pounds on his car demanding answers. He furiously blames Benny for appearing on television and causing more panic, and tells him to do damage control. Afterward, Benny addresses the victims in the stadium, explaining in detail what the powder is. They will be asked a series of questions about their daily routines and which places the powder may have reached. Evandro and his family want to know when they can go home, but Benny tells them he does not yet know how long decontamination will take. Minutes later, Dr. Paula from the Institute of Radiation Protection and Dosimetry arrives with as many devices as she could carry to help speed up the examination process. Marcio tries to interview the family, but they refuse to cooperate. At least Edmilson mentions the bus, and Marcio is horrified to realize that every passenger on that bus was exposed. He rushes to tell the team all the contaminated locations and drops the news about the bus. Paula immediately tells Roberto to shut down public transportation. Roberto refuses because it will push the town into further chaos. Paula then asks Evandro's family to hand over all their personal belongings, including their wedding rings. Celeste does not want to give up her doll, so Benny offers to put it in a box like a little dollhouse and promises to feed her. Celeste finally lets go. Everyone then has to wash with water and vinegar, which burns their wounds. Blood samples are taken afterward. Once test results come back, most of Evandro's family must go to the general hospital because they are genuinely sick. This includes Celeste and her brother, but their mother Katerina is unaffected. She refuses to let her daughter go even if it means exposing herself to contamination. Her husband João is also sick and assures Katerina that he will take care of their children. They have a heartbreaking goodbye before the bus leaves. At the clinic, Marcio uses the device to examine the sick patients and asks Gabriella for details about the bus she took. Unfortunately, she cannot remember whether it was bus 8 or bus 9. Suddenly, Devere starts screaming in pain, and Dr. Ricardo asks for an injection. The nurse refuses to approach the patient, and Ricardo has to firmly remind her to do her job. The medicine manages to calm Devere down. At the general hospital, striking doctors and nurses are blocking the street, demanding better supplies and working conditions. The patients are guided out of the ambulance toward the isolation area. However, Devere cannot move, and his body keeps shaking uncontrollably. When the bus from the stadium arrives, Evandro finally reunites with Gabriella. Once everyone is inside the isolated building, the guards lock the door. Shortly after, 2 doctors and a physicist arrive at the hospital to help. The physicist's counter immediately reacts to one of the ambulances, and they find Devere inside. They ask for a stretcher, but the striking nurses refuse to help. Inside the isolated building, the patients discover that the bathrooms are also locked. They get no answer from the guards and start panicking and pounding on the door. At that moment, the doctors bring Devere in, but the guards hesitate to open the door because of the violence on the other side. The family finally agrees to calm down when they see the terrible state Devere is in, and the guards open the door. Devere is taken to a private room, and the doctors manage to stabilize him, though his fever is high and the blisters are spreading. Everyone changes into new clothes sealed with tape. The physicist explains there is a daily limit of radiation exposure and gives them 2 dosimeter devices to monitor themselves. The doctors then introduce themselves to the patients and explain that portable toilets will be brought in because their waste is dangerous. They also encourage the patients to talk more openly about their routines and who they came into contact with. Shortly after, Paula and Benny visit all the contaminated sites using the information the doctors gathered and realize they also need to catch all the stray dogs in the area. At Devire's house, the counter goes wild at the exact spot where the capsule was opened. Some powder had fallen onto the ground while they were working on it. On their way to the scrapyard, Devere and Lucio had also played a casual soccer game with some local kids on the street. The scrapyard itself is already sealed, so the team moves on to Evandro's house, where the counter gives its strongest reading of all. Gabriella's account explains why. Evandro had found the glowing powder fascinating and poured it on the table to show the whole family. Everyone took a small amount of powder home with them, and one woman even rubbed some on her skin because it looked so pretty. At Joao's house, Paula gets another strong reading. It turns out Joao had told Celeste it was stardust that fell from the sky and put it on the table for her to play with. However, Katerina thought it was trash and threw it down the sink, which means the water pipes could be contaminated. The counter does react to the sink, but the river appears to be clean. They speak to a neighbor and search her house, finding more powder on a household altar. They immediately contact police to evacuate and seal the area. Because Celeste had eaten dinner without washing her hands, The doctors do not think she can be properly treated at this hospital. They call the Naval Hospital in Rio de Janeiro, and the admiral says only 6 beds are available, so they must choose only the most critical cases to transfer. At the bus stop, Marcio watches his counter every time a bus passes. When it finally reacts, he boards the bus and passengers panic at the sight of the device. Marcio asks them to stay calm and get tested, but they keep panicking. He convinces the driver not to open the doors and to head straight to the stadium. Governor Roberto is still trying to convince the press that contamination only happened in a small area, but they stop believing him when several vehicles arrive carrying more victims. Reporters rush to Marcio and he tells the public that anyone who rode this particular bus in the past 48 hours should go to the stadium immediately. Afterward, Roberto scolds the team for going around him, but Paula and Benny silence him when they tell him the powder may have reached the pipes and the air. Their conversation is interrupted by rain, which will make the contamination significantly worse. The next morning, Paula checks all the rivers and is relieved to confirm they are clean. However, the rain may have caused problems with household wells. Reporters contact random outside experts to keep their coverage going, and these experts frighten the public further by claiming the water is contaminated. Roberto panics and tells Benny to appear at a press conference to clarify that the water is safe, refusing to wait for test results. At home, Marcio gets ready to return to the stadium. Bianca reminds him they have plane tickets to leave that afternoon, and he promises to be back in time. At the stadium, the crowd has grown even larger. Benny tells Marcio he must train police and soldiers to collect samples and use the counters. Marcio tries to explain he needs to leave, but Benny gives him no chance to finish. Soon, Marcio is on a boat on the river teaching the team how to collect samples, while helicopters scan the area from above. At the hospital, the doctors must decide which 6 patients to send to Rio de Janeiro. 6 are clearly in worse condition than the others, but João is stable, which would mean Celeste would go to Rio without a parent. The doctors make patients drink large amounts of water and exercise regularly to help purge the contamination from their bodies. They also tell Dever he will be transferred to Rio, and he worries about how to tell his mother, who has no phone, and whom he cannot write to because he cannot read. The doctors offer to write the letter for him. When they tell Evandro he is also being transferred, the other patients want to know why only certain people are chosen. The doctors explain they are only sending those who need more advanced treatment. One patient gets angry when he learns he cannot go with his daughter. Everyone argues and Evandro refuses to leave. In private, Gabriela tells the doctors to give her spot to someone who needs it more. At the stadium, Katerina is told she is free to go, but her house has been sealed and her family is in hospital, so she has nowhere to go. A doctor overhears this, lends Katerina clean clothes, and gives her some money. Outside, Benny examines Bianca and assures her she is not contaminated. She asks for Marcio, but he is not around. At the hospital, Katerina tries to visit her family, but the guards will not let her through. She waits outside until she sees her family being put on the bus for Rio, and the doctors allow her a final goodbye. They share a hug and words of love before the bus pulls away, and Celeste rushes to the window to keep waving at her mother. Afterward, Katerina tries to go home to collect a few things, but the guards block her there too. After watching workers aggressively round up all the dogs in the area, she goes to a friend's house and asks to stay, but the friend turns her away out of fear. After Paula and Marcio confirm the river is clean and start heading back, the counter suddenly reacts. They trace it to a truck and chase it down until the driver pulls over. The paper cargo in the back makes the counter go wild. The driver explains it came from a warehouse, so Marcio goes with him while Paula takes the samples to the lab. At the warehouse, Marcio confirms everything is contaminated because the warehouse had purchased scrap from Dever and Lucio. All the paper must be disposed of and the building quarantined. The warehouse owner complains because he needs to work to support his family. Marcio tells him plainly that staying here could kill his children. At the police station, Chief Marlene receives the case file and is asked to determine who is responsible. She begins by questioning Clovis, the owner of the land where the abandoned clinic stands. Clovis explains that he owns the land but not the building or anything inside it, so it was not his responsibility to clean it or post guards. His company bought the land from Santa Asa Hospital, but when they arrived, the clinic was still operating on it, belonging to the Goiás Institute of Radiotherapy. Santa Asa had sold the land before the clinic officially closed, and the clinic refused to leave until forced out by legal proceedings. When Clovis began demolition, the clinic filed an injunction to stop them. He did see the capsule, but assumed it was trash since he could not have imagined the clinic would abandon radioactive equipment. Next, Marlene questions the manager of Santa Asa Hospital, who explains they had a non-profit arrangement with the radiotherapy clinic requiring it to provide free cancer care for hospital patients. Over time, the clinic breached the contract by charging patients, so the manager sold the land. Marlene scolds her for doing so without first evicting the clinic. In Rio de Janeiro, the patients are given private rooms, and Celeste is separated from João. Meanwhile, lab tests on the patient's urine reveal radiation so extreme the scanner cannot measure it accurately at close range. The lab calls the doctors and informs them that the remaining patients should also be transferred because their internal contamination is dangerously high. When Gabriella begins having a seizure, the doctors sedate her immediately, but at this rate she will not survive. Exhausted and frustrated, one doctor rushes outside and tells a reporter what is truly happening, then begs the striking hospital workers to cooperate. Finally understanding the gravity of the situation, several staff members agree to help. At the stadium, Paula reports that the wells may be contaminated. Marcio has even worse news. Some of the contaminated paper is already on a truck headed to Sao Paulo. Benny calls an institute in that city and orders them to evacuate the paper factory and surround the truck the moment it arrives. Marcio finally goes home, but Bianca has already left. That night, the doctor's statement from outside the hospital is broadcast on television, and doctors in Rio de Janeiro rush to the Naval Hospital to volunteer their services for the additional patients. Meanwhile, Catarina tries to buy a bus ticket to Rio, but does not have enough money. At the hospital, Edmilson refuses to keep exercising and has to be persuaded to take his medicine. When a doctor checks on him later, his bed is empty and the window is open. Edmilson has made his way to his usual bar looking for a drink, but nobody wants him there and the bartender refuses to sell. He tries to steal something. The other customers threaten him with a broken bottle and a gun, but Edmilson is not afraid to face them. Just as someone is about to shoot him, police and doctors arrive to take him back to the hospital. At the press conference, Roberto tells Benny to announce that the water is clean. Benny informs reporters that the rivers are fine, but everyone demands to know about tap water. Desperate, Benny fills a bottle directly from a public fountain and drinks it in front of everyone just as Paula arrives with the test results, confirming that tap water is also safe. However, a reporter brings up the truck heading to Sao Paulo and accuses Benny of hiding information. Benny explains the factory has been shut down, but the police are still sent to block the roads. On the sixth day, the team focuses on decontaminating the affected areas. At Evandro's house, Marcio approaches a stray dog gently, but it jumps on him and bites his arm before running off. Marcio is now at risk of exposure and is sent to hospital. Meanwhile, Evandro falls into a coma, and the doctors cannot revive him. Gabriella, Evandro, and several other seriously ill patients are transferred to the Naval Hospital. A specialist doctor from Russia arrives with his team ready to assist. However, they are immediately angry to find the hospital not following all necessary protocols, that staff are not fully protected, that the wrong people are in certain areas, and that medicine dosages are too high. Their argument is cut short by a phone call from a scientist describing an experimental treatment used for leukemia patients that strengthens the immune system and could help radiation victims. The Russians dismiss it, calling the man behind it a fraud. Soon the doctors get a call from the hospital dean scolding them for ignoring the experts he sent. The doctors point out that the Russians' experience is with Chernobyl, which was a different type of contamination, and that their own dosages have been producing positive results confirmed by the tests. The dean allows them to continue. When Caesar finally arrives in Goiânia, he and Benny meet with Roberto, who is furious because nobody wants to buy the soy and rice produced in their region anymore. He refuses to keep the barrels of radioactive material in his city. Caesar and Benny point out that moving them is far too dangerous. Roberto does not care and gives them their instructions. Benny must find the best empty locations to place the barrels, and Caesar must use his influence as head of the institution to secure approval from the relevant state. If they do not cooperate, Roberto will blame them publicly for everything. Benny then visits Marcio, who has also been exercising heavily. Marcio admits he does not know whether to tell Bianca about his possible exposure. Benny advises honesty. Benny later calls Bianca and discovers she has developed anemia from the stress and decides not to share the news after all. On day 15, Marlene questions one of the clinic's former owners. He removed the fencing, roof tiles, doors, and window frames, but somehow the capsule was left behind. He claims he removed the doors but was not permitted to take anything else, and was never told the capsule was there because they were rushed. All the evacuated residents are staying in a shelter. A doctor brings Katerina to the general hospital so she can see her son. They cannot touch but can at least share words of love through the barrier. At the naval hospital, Evandro finally wakes up. Unfortunately, Gabriella is getting worse, and the doctors want to try the experimental treatment, but the Russians keep refusing. The doctors go to the hospital dean, who refuses to act behind the Russians' backs. In frustration, one doctor quits and leaves. On day 20, Marlene questions the other clinic owner. He claims Santa Asa evicted them and did not allow them to take anything. He also denies breaching the contract, saying Santasa invented that story to justify selling the land. He insists he did notify the Nuclear Energy Commission about the abandoned equipment and that the commission never inspected the clinic while it was open, though he cannot prove this. Meanwhile, Marcio calls Bianca every day, and since he is not hearing the news, she is the one who tells him the barrels will be transported to another state. Tired of keeping secrets, he finally tells her he may be infected, but says he does not regret anything because he has helped so many people. However, Ednilson does not see him as a hero and holds him responsible for everything. For the past several weeks, Katerina has been working as a cleaning lady. On day 22, she sees on the news that her daughter is in critical condition and decides to use all her savings to buy a ticket to Rio. But access to the city is restricted, and anyone who wants to enter must show a certificate proving they are not contaminated. The bus is turned back and all the passengers are brought home. At the naval hospital, Evandro sneaks out of his room to try to visit his wife, but the doctors stop him. They are interrupted by news that Celeste is not responding. The doctors rush to stabilize her, but there is very little they can do. Caesar uses his influence to arrange a meeting with the medical board so the doctor who quit can return and present her case. When the Russians try to protest, the doctors point out that this is not Chernobyl, and the board approves the experimental treatment. On day 25, the medicine arrives and the doctors administer it to their patients immediately. Sometime later, various indigenous communities travel to the capital to protest because the barrels are to be stored on their lands. Roberto ignores them until another governor calls to say he is prepared to fight him before the president. At the hospital, Celeste and Gabriella receive the new treatment, but sadly it comes too late for both of them. They suffer heart attacks, and despite everything the doctors do, both Celeste and Gabriella die. When it is time for the burial, the bodies are placed in lead-reinforced coffins. Protesters gather to complain that the burials will contaminate the environment. Katerina weeps over Celeste's coffin until she is gently pulled away. When the coffins are buried, the protesters become violent and the team has to be escorted out under protection. On day 32, scrapyard workers also die. Evandro is consumed by guilt and asks to see his brother, convincing the doctor by pointing out that he was not allowed to see his wife before she died. He keeps a safe distance and reads a poem aloud before apologizing in tears, taking responsibility for the tragedy he set in motion. Eventually, Marcio is discharged from hospital, and his father comes to collect him, but Marcio wants to return to work immediately. Meanwhile, Benny and Caesar advise Roberto that he will not look bad for storing the barrels if the order comes from the president himself, and they have contacts in Congress who can make it happen. Roberto agrees to begin building a storage facility, and they will tell the public it is temporary until the final orders come through. Sometime later, Benny is informed he is being charged by the federal prosecutor with manslaughter. Caesar and his lawyer want him to shift the blame onto the health department, but Benny admits his own institution also failed to conduct the necessary checks. Since he will not be able to work, he asks Marcio to design the storage facility for the barrels. Thanks to Caesar's contacts, a new law is passed making each state responsible for managing its own radioactive waste. Marcio leads the construction of the facility, and on day 45, the capsule is finally removed from the health department. But when the trucks try to take it to the facility, protesters block the road. Emerson tries to negotiate, but the crowd refuses to speak with anyone other than the governor. Roberto agrees to meet them, but the meeting goes badly. The protesters agree to open the road in 2 days only, on the condition that the barrels are taken somewhere else entirely. The team meets to find alternative solutions, but there is no other location in the entire area that meets all the requirements. Marcio argues they should break the deal and store everything at the original facility anyway. Roberto does not want conflict with his own people. Benny tells him to simply say that the team acted without his authorization. At the hospital, Joao's condition is worsening and the doctor calls his son. Joao cannot speak, but cries quietly as his son tells him he loves him and that he misses his sister. Elsewhere, Dever's arm has reached an advanced stage of necrosis, and amputation is the only way to save his life. The Russians oppose the procedure, and even the admiral protests because the surgeons would be exposed to radiation. But the doctors say they have already found volunteers. During the operation, they almost lose Dever, but the procedure ultimately goes well. All the doctors are scanned afterward to check their exposure levels. Even the Russians admit the doctors made the right call. When Dever wakes up, a letter from his mother is waiting for him, and the doctor reads it aloud. Later, the doctors confirm that the treatment has successfully healed Joao as well. That night, Marcio and Paula take the trucks to the storage site, only to find the protesters blocking the road even at this late hour. In the morning, reporters cover the standoff. When Marcio addresses the crowd directly, appealing to their sense of responsibility and their shared humanity, he finally changes enough minds and the barrels are brought to the storage facility. In a public interview, Benny acknowledges that the Nuclear Energy Commission and the related institutions responsible for overseeing clinics share responsibility for what happened. He also names Gabriella the true heroine of the crisis because she was the one who brought the capsule to the health department and prevented the situation from becoming catastrophically worse. To prevent future disasters, the Commission signs an agreement to strengthen inspections of radiotherapy equipment and introduce stricter control policies. This is enough for the charges against Benny to be dropped, though Caesar is furious because their institution is now under intense government scrutiny. Before Marcio flies home, Benny tells him he has recommended him for a position at the Nuclear Energy Commission, so they will be working together again soon. The government begins demolishing all the contaminated buildings. Katerina sneaks into the sealed area to watch her own house come down. Paula finds her there and promises the government will help rebuild her life, then hands her a photograph of Celeste that was not contaminated. While Marcio reunites with Bianca in Rio, Joao and Evandro are finally released from hospital, though they must return regularly for checkups. 2 more survivors are released in December, while Edmilson and the final surviving patient must wait a little longer until their tests are completely clear. This film was based on a true story. The Goiânia accident is considered the worst nuclear incident ever to occur outside of a nuclear power plant. 5 employees of the Radiotherapy Institute were convicted of involuntary manslaughter, and the National Nuclear Energy Commission was ordered to pay 1 million reais to guarantee medical care for the victims. The emergency protocols developed by the team became a global reference for handling radioactive incidents. There have been no incidents at the storage site to this day. The Health Surveillance Agency was converted into a state center for victims of radiological accidents. In addition to the initial 4 deaths, 16 more deaths were later found to be related to radiation exposure from the incident. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel and like the video. Thanks for watching.